What's up, everybody, and welcome to the 14th episode of Stags in the Studio of the 2024-2025 academic calendar year. I'm Logan Rundy, your Assistant Sports Director here at WVOF radio station. Diagonal and across the table is Sports Director Andrew Jameson. Our guest today is the first lay and ninth Ignatian president of Fairfield University. He was a part of creating one of Fairfield's campuses in Bellarmine campus over in Bridgeport, Connecticut. He also led the largest capital completion campaign in the university's history at $218 million. Prior to Fairfield, our guest today was the dean of the Graham School of Continuing Liberal and Professional Studies at the University of Chicago. He's also an author of Ivory Towers and Nationalist Minds, University's Leadership in the Development of the American State. Our guest has also spoken at many higher educational forums across the world, including the White House Forum of College Affordability. He graduated with a bachelor's degree in English from Yale and was an all-Ivy League rugby player, and then finished his education with a master's degree in education and a PhD in political science from the University of Michigan. Our guest today is none other than Fairfield University President Mark Nemec. Mr. President, welcome to our studio.
Thrilled to be here.
To start kind of today, after your graduation, you received all of your degrees. What got you into higher education?
That's a great question. So less than linear path, though, depending on how one looks at my biography, it might seem very linear. I authored some academic books. I was a dean at the University of Chicago. I came here. But actually right upon completing graduate school or at the end of my graduate studies, I actually taught at Davidson College in North Carolina, pre-Steph Curry. This was in 99, 2000 days. But realized my wife and I had just met, so we were still dating, and it was a fabulous place where we could have spent the rest of our lives, but we weren't really ready for the rest of our lives to begin just yet. Mm-hmm. Davidson's a small town. The life of a junior professor, I enjoyed some aspects, especially the teaching and student engagement aspect. I enjoyed the research aspect. Academic conference aspect, not so much. And so it was a period where the management consultancies, the McKinseys, Bains of the world, were deigning to talk to PhD students. So I ended up at basically something that was halfway between a think tank and a consultancy called the Advisory Board Company, and spent 14 years in the private sector focusing on helping organizations use data, become more effective, achieve their strategies. But it always, even before I started on that journey, been very passionate about higher education and the role of universities in society. So my academic work was on the role of the research university at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. So basically the period from Civil War to World War I. I actually teach an honors seminar with Dean Greenwell on that. So I'd always been interested in universities as entities that shape societies and shape people. And so when the opportunity at the last of my private sector gigs was to run a research firm consultancy that consulted to higher ed, I jumped at the chance. It was a really interesting opportunity at a place called Edge Ventures. And from there, I was approached by the University of Chicago about being a dean for really helping them think about lifelong learning and especially online learning. This was back a decade ago when the University of Chicago wasn't doing anything online or doing anything in terms of outreach in that regard. And it was really from there that the Fairfield opportunity presented itself.
You mentioned the Fairfield opportunity. What was it about Fairfield that drew you? I feel like we asked this to every athlete, but I'm curious from a president's perspective.
Well, that's a great question. I would say for me, it started as it does for all of us who work here with mission, right? I went to the Jesuit Catholic High School in Los Angeles, Loyola High School of Los Angeles. The mission of a Jesuit Catholic university is very appealing. The commitment to forming young men and women for and with others. And so that was one of the first things that got my attention when I was approached by someone about this opportunity. But then secondly, I think for me was about the idea that this was an institution that even in a very cursory glance had enormous potential, meaning it had always been a very strong university, but given its relative youth, given its location, given its opportunities for impact, I saw presented to me an opportunity to really shape a university in a way that could meet the needs of the 21st century versus just coming in. And sometimes when you're approached about opportunities such as this, the notion is, well, they just want to go back to what they were once doing, right? Or they're in desperate straits and it's a rebuild. And this was neither of those. This was an opportunity for an institution that everyone said had an amazing impact on their lives, the trustees and others, but that folks also felt could do so much more, given scale, given impact, given opportunity.
Yeah, and you mentioned just being involved in a really young university, right? Now that you've been at Fairfield for a number of years, how have you seen it evolve over the years in general?
Well, as you alluded to, I mean, we've significantly grown. We've grown not just in our scale, but also, we continue to invest in quality, right? New programs, new facilities. It's not the only measure of one's quality, but certainly amongst, those who are prospective students, admit rate is certainly something that is considered, right? And so having brought the admit rate down from 72%, a decade ago to 25% this year, which is just to be published, having gone from being the 50th most selective Catholic university in the country to now, and it's not public, there's one website you can see it, we've now surpassed Villanova in terms of selectivity. So we're the 5th most selective Catholic university. There's Notre Dame, Georgetown, Boston College, Holy Cross, and then us. Those to me are measures of what the broader environment is reflecting upon and what they're seeing, which is an institution that is value-based, is student-centric. And I think that's one of the keys is regardless of growth in overall undergraduate and graduate population, we still put the student at the center. And we're outcomes focused, right? We recognize that our role is to form young men and women to lead those lives of purpose, to find their calling, and hopefully have some success at it.
And you mentioned the student-centric. I can't think of a more student-centric venue on campus than Leo D. Mahoney Arena, which opened in fall of 2022, where basketball and volleyball are now playing their home games. What has that establishment, the development of Mahoney Arena, really done for this school as a whole, and what was the timeline of it look like?
Well, that's a really interesting question to reflect on because I don't know if the story of how Mahoney was built has ever been fully told. But one thing to note is we were actually ready to go a little earlier, but this thing called COVID got in the way, right? And people forget how, I think in a healthy way, we've sort of forgotten, how intrusive COVID regulations were, not just for students, but for things like construction workers, right? And so we were dead set, ready to go, had actually a going away party for Mahoney Arena in late February of 2020, and then COVID hit. And so, there was some discussion, well, should we keep going forward? And one of the things that struck me was even if we wanted to, would we be able to build given the uncertainty around regulations, around employment, around bringing people from off campus to construction? So we paused it for a year. It was the right decision. It didn't impact our timeline other than, okay, we might have been able to open up a year earlier, but even then it's a little uncertain looking at supply chains and things like that. And so the philanthropic support, which was enormously instrumental in getting the building built, was really animated by what Mahoney has become, which is, yes, it's a venue for our men's and women's basketball teams and for our volleyball team, but so much more, it's really a hub for so much of campus activity, right? The students it brings to games, but also, we are going to be there in about a month for our student research symposium, right? We hold our graduate commencement there. The Bishop of Bridgeport asked us to host the Mass of Eucharistic Renewal there. We had 4,000 people from all over Fairfield County for that. The governor gave an address to the Bridgeport Business Council just over a month ago there. So it's funny because when we first started envisioning it, we were modeling it a little bit off Notre Dame's nomenclature, and we called it the Arena and Convocation Center. And people joked and they said, well, it's really going to be an arena. How much convening are we going to do of other things? Well, it turns out we've done a lot, right? And so in that way, it truly is a hub. And it's especially a hub, obviously, for athletic programs. I think the success we've had to date across our athletic programs, winning the Commissioner's Cup last year, continuing to be the dominant program in women's sports, winning pretty much every team title one can win. We missed out on swimming, but that's individuals that are collected. But winning field hockey, women's soccer, and winning women's basketball over the past year, I think is a testament to Vice President Schlickman and the work he's done, the coaches and their work. But I think it's also a reflection of the community's support for athletics, and Mahoney is obviously in some ways the embodiment of that.
Yeah, and you mentioned, as Leo D. Mahoney Arena is really that hub of campus. It's a great term. we have, as you mentioned, all of those events. We have our FUSA event uses it for, concerts and things like that, comedians, whatever that may be. So it's a great space to have as a college student, but also, as you mentioned, part of the community. You have a large background in athletics, especially in rugby. How have you used that? You are a huge supporter of our athletics program. How have you, integrated that into your presidential term, if you will?
Well, I would say for us, athletics are like any endeavor we undertake, which is we're committed, to this concept of modern excellence, right? We want to be a university of national prominence. We are a university of national prominence now. And how does athletics fit into that? And I would say it's really three ways. First and foremost is as educators, it's really critical that our student athletes and our students who are fans, see it as part of their developmental experience. So it's both celebrating wins, but it's also dealing with setbacks that are losses or moments as our student athletes have where, in competition and practice, they're really developing as their best selves, right? How to work with one another, how to push oneself, how to push one's teammates. Those are all so essential to the student athlete experiences. It's this notion of, developmentally, how does it really shape these young men and women to be their best selves, right? I would say secondly, and related to that, I think folks are aware, I like to compete. And so if we're going to be in the arena, as it were, generically, because it can be the court, it can be the field, it can be the pool, it can be the diamond, one has to, in the famous Herm Edwards quote, play to win the games, right? That is, and it's about not winning above all else, but it's about giving one's best effort to achieve a result, which in many cases can and should be a win. And then lastly, athletic fits for us at the Division I level is I do think it's a really effective platform by which we can tell our story, right? I think most folks are somewhat aware of Fairfield University, but using athletics, and it doesn't just have to be men's and women's basketball, right? The fact that our men's lacrosse team is now ranked in the top 20 certainly gets us notice. The success we've had, as I mentioned earlier, in women's athletics across the board gets us notice. So using athletics as a vehicle by which our story is better understood is also really critical to how I think of it fitting within the institution, right? So if and I think where we are so blessed is that we have an alignment as a university, as an athletic department, around a set of core values that allow us to tell a story in a way. You were there for Coach Carly Thibault-Didana's press conference, right? To have the head coach of your women's basketball team at an NCAA press conference talk about how she recruits against your values, meaning she basically uses them as a tool to engender interest from high-level student athletes is really heartening, right? Because it speaks to the fact that at a lot of universities, not even just D1 universities, athletics is sort of an entity unto itself. Whereas here, it's fully integrated into who we are and what we aspire to be.
No, I really like that point about athletics as part of the development of the student athlete. The term student is first in student athlete. I feel like that's often an overlooked aspect. I guess you mentioned the likes of working with Paul Schlickman, Zach Dayton. How closely do you work with the athletics administration? And if you do, what does that role maybe look like?
Well, it's sort of typical of how I would work with any unit within the university, which is, as president, you have ultimate responsibility, but as a leader, you also have to trust your colleagues to do what's right and, more importantly, do what their best judgment says in their areas of expertise, right? And so, I would say particular to athletics, it's the most high profile of areas in some ways, right? So, a member of your faculty doesn't give their best performance in the lecture hall or in a lab, you're not hearing about it on Twitter, right? Unfortunately, in the nature of this world, college athletics is what sort of gets the biggest sort of buzz and hype, or fortunately, when you have success, right? So I would say, where I work with the department, obviously I tend to work most directly with Vice President Schlickman, is just, as a sounding board, as a resources, I can be helpful to them. So it can be everything from, as we're undergoing search for a new field hockey coach, meeting with prospective candidates and giving my thoughts about how they would be ambassadors. I certainly can't talk about how they're going to coach the team, but I can talk about how they might fit in the culture.
And
if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I'm curious. We just obviously just hired Laura Gebhardt for field hockey, and the decorated resume herself, coming from the likes of most recently Penn State. What was that process like?
Well, again, for myself as president, I see my role as much as a recruiter as a vetter, right? In that one of the things that I think does attract such high quality coaches to Fairfield is the notion that, one, they're going to get support from the highest level, right? Two, that they're going to, if they're going to be successful, embrace the mission and embrace the values. And so as president, that's one of the things I articulate about how, as I just did with you, athletics fits into those mission and values. And then I would say three is just as somebody who is passionate about making sure that our student athletes are truly flourishing, is really underscoring that aspect, right? And signaling that it's one of the things that we are most attentive to is the well-being and the flourishing, right? Because I think one of the things, this is true for every student we have, and I say this also as a parent of four young people who are college age and younger, I think sometimes all of us as parents forget that setbacks, challenges, disappointments, hurts are going to be part of a young person's experience. And it is not our job as administrators or as coaches to snowplow all of those away, because then that's not developmentally effective. It is instead to make sure, especially in our situation as a Jesuit Catholic university, our students are mindful, that they are reflective, and that they are learning from every experience, be it a good one or a bad one.
And I think you mentioned, you have so many different elements to what this university has and having that trust. So as the top, as a leader, what are your top values that you would induce every single day?
Stewardship is probably the most important concept I would use to begin with, which is the idea that our responsibility as any leader in any role is to leave an institution better than one found it, right? So that's first and foremost. I would say second is this notion that one, as a steward, is never doing it alone, right? That it is always a collective and a team effort. That we only function as well as we function as a collective. It doesn't mean everyone is always doing the same thing in the same way, but it's that we're mindful of how others work, right? And so the core values that undergird that are really trust, are a commitment to excellence, and then the final piece of that is deep, deep, deep sense of gratitude and integrity. And those two are aligned to the extent that this truly is, in the best possible sense for any of us, but especially to be president, a privilege to be at Fairfield University. And so how are we honoring that privilege? How are we grateful for that? And then how do we then manage in such a way, how do we lead in such a way that is reflective of that, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think, just being as a young person, you mentioned earlier, going through that hardship and being a leader actively, as someone that's kind of made it to the highest level at an institution and really in life, how do you, I guess, what's your biggest advice for current college students that are unsure about their future?
Oh, that's a tough one. And because the challenge being, I also have, as I said, 4 kids, college sophomore and younger. Well, if I was speaking to a college student in particular, one thing I would say is to always be mindful of a search for purpose, but recognize it's a long journey, right? And it's also not a linear path. So you asked earlier about my interest in being involved in higher education. Well, it's something I had before I even got to college, right? It was before I even got to grad school. I grew up in the shadow of UCLA. I'd always been interested in higher education. And yet, there was a long period of my career, which I enjoyed immeasurably, where I had nothing to do with higher education, right? Mm-hmm. So I think the values that I was attracted to in higher education that I also observed in the workforce outside of higher ed when I was working in consultancies. It's funny, I was just talking to Coach Debo Dodontis about this over at lunch, was I having fun and was I learning, right? I think for any young person, not every moment of every job is going to be fun, and you're not going to be learning in every moment in every job, right? But one's ability to sort of find learning experiences, no matter what the setting is, I think is going to be critical. So personally, as I said, one could look at my resume and say it's been very linear. Yale, Michigan PhD, Davidson professor, dean at U Chicago, then a president at Fairfield University. There's a total different way of looking at my experience and say, well, it's been a random walk, right? And life is sort of a combination of both. There's been a number of times in my life where I was convinced I was going to be doing one thing and I ended up doing another. And so I think one of the other bits of advice I would say is be open to experiences, right? Because the number of times in my life where I've thought I was absolutely set in going in one direction, and then either things happen for good or for tragedy in a personal context, and that vision changes is not infinite, but it's certainly numerous, right? And so, I don't tend to be very good at giving sort of very simple advice because life isn't simple.
Right.
But the advice I would give to any student, and I try to give to our children, is to try to always pause and be in the moment and give time for reflection. But at the same time, my personality is one, and again, this is where it's very individualized because even amongst our 4 children, I have some who can be sort of, as Ignatius says, contemplatives in action. And that's how I tend to operate. If I really need to reflect on something, I start doing something. But there's other folks and other children of our children who it is in their best interest to just sort of take a pause and step back, right? And so knowing oneself well enough to know where you get energy and where you get insight is not easy, but being attuned to that, I don't know if that makes sense.
Of course, yeah.
And it's one of those things I didn't learn until later in my career. So, for example, I was at Forrester Research. So this would have been, I started 20 years ago. So I was 35 years old. So still relatively mature, right? You'd think you'd have a lot figured out. And they put us through the Myers-Briggs. I don't know if you know what that is, but it's a personality assessment. It's basically this notion of what you get energy from. And what was funny about that was it finally occurred to me that I'd written a dissertation that got turned into a 300-page book, but I actually don't get energy from writing. I like to talk. I like to speak. Mm-hmm. So if you said to me, you got to write a 2-page paper, I'd be like, okay. If you said you got to go speak to 20,000 people in 5 minutes, I would do that in a heartbeat, right? Mm-hmm. But it wasn't until I undertook that assessment that I realized deep down the energy I get is much more from articulating my thoughts verbally than it is from putting them to paper, right? Even though I do it a lot still. And so those kinds of insights and being open to those kinds of insights, I think, is one of the important elements for any young person and any person, right? Because I think all of us, even when you're my age, 55 years old, sometimes you can get so wrapped up in your day-to-day that you're not making that space, even if it's just intellectual space, because you could still be busy, but just giving your time to sort of just sit and reflect.
You mentioned the emphasis on, focusing on the present because nobody knows what, the future holds. And even like you mentioned, like the acceptance rate has dropped over like 50% since this decade. Like, I don't know if anyone could have seen that coming. I guess I would translate to the athletics side. What are you hoping for the future of Fairfield athletics? I know winning always helps, but I guess maybe on a more deeper and whether if it's like related to like the student growth and all of that, just from your perspective, what takes priority and like the goals?
Well, that's one thing I guess I also hopefully embraces and value is that avoid false oppositions, right? So I think one can be, as a university, extremely successful on the field and on the court and in the diamond pool, and also be extremely strong academically, right? We've seen that. There are models of that. I would say for us, Fairfield is blessed to be in a position in terms of our enrollments, in terms of our Jesuit Catholic tradition, which grounds everything we do and I think gives us a ballast, as it were, that, all the challenges of NIL and attacks on higher ed, we're willing and able and ready to weather those, if that makes sense. And so when people say, what's the vision for athletics? To me, it's no different than the vision for the university, which is to be the Jesuit Catholic University of national prominence for the 21st century. And when I say the, what I mean is to do it in such a way, because there are other fabulous Jesuit Catholic universities out there, too many to name, but they all were built and sort of came to maturity for the 20th century. This is where our relative youth is a huge advantage for us. We haven't actually fully defined what we're going to be as a university, nor what we're going to fully be as an athletic department in a good way. And what that suggests to me is the opportunity to do something no one else has done yet, right? And I think that means success for our student athletes on whatever field of endeavor they're in athletically, but also to say that, wow, Fairfield student athletes are going on to do amazing things. This is very similar to what Coach Carley said, to change the world, right? That the men and women who have graduated from Fairfield University as student athletes, as representative of all of Fairfield students, are going on and really doing great things for the greater good and to serve society and serve more than themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned, this is something I never thought about before, how young we are. This is only the 83rd year, I believe, that this institution has been running. And so I think being able to still realize your identity and figure that out, and then once you figure out our identity and then rise to the top, and as we've been doing. So I think that's really important. Before we continue kind of the back half of our conversation, we have a segment here. It's called Quick Fire Questions. So what we do is I have about 6 questions just so people can get to know you a little bit better. 1 or 2 sentence answer, and how you'd like to answer. That's up to you.
Okay.
Sound good?
You've been with me long enough. You realize I don't give 1 or 2 sentences.
I know.
I've only got 1 or 2. Don't worry.
Okay, so I'll go first. I'll go favorite Fairfield tradition.
You could be here all day.
Well, no, I had an answer, but then I get in trouble. I'll say President's Ball, selfishly.
President's Ball? Fair enough.
Let's see.
But then I was going to say Christmas tree lighting because the family's there. But anyway.
Do you have a favorite interaction with a team thus far this year?
Well, winning championships is a favorite.
That's always good.
So I will actually. I'll see. This isn't a 1 or 2.
That's okay.
Answer.
You can go a little off it.
I will say, and it's just been on a few occasions, but when you get invited into, be it just after a practice or after a win or a loss, into a team's locker room, which is a sacred space for them, to be sort of welcomed into that space is very humbling, even as president, because it's not my locker room, right? It's the team's locker room. And so, anytime I've had an opportunity to be with a team in their locker room, it's just, and not to get too sort of philosophical about this, but one of the things I would also say as advice is you also have to be open to those moments where you're just sort of overwhelmed by gratitude. And, I've been blessed to have a number of those in my time at Fairfield, but certainly those times when I've been able to be with teams, again, not just after successes, but after moments of loss or even just in the day-to-day of the academic year or the athletic competition year where you were invited in. It's actually pretty special.
Favorite pair of socks ever worn?
Oh, man.
I knew this was going to be a hard question.
There's a sort of, and I should probably wear them more often. There's sort of a plain red pair of socks that I got when I was over in Italy that are sort of the go-to.
Interesting.
I'm all good. I'm going to save my one for last.
Okay. Favorite Fairfield moment?
Of all time?
All time. If you can't pick one, choose 3.
No. Well, I mean, selfishly, I will say
President's Ball?
I don't know if that's my favorite moment, but it's a good time. I mean, for me, so much is about being blessed with a fabulous family, and so it's not. I wouldn't say it's my favorite moment of all time, other than really the first moment that struck me. How's that?
Sure, that's just as good.
Well, no, I'll offer 2, and I don't want to get too somber, so I'll give the lighter one first. But the moment, and I'll give Jim Fitzpatrick credit for this, where during the inauguration week, they did all kinds of events, like event after event after event after event. And Jim Fitz took me aside and said, in a very Ignatian way, you got to make sure you find a moment just for yourself, right? And so the moment that struck me was actually during my inauguration. They have a whole ceremony. It's sort of like a commencement, right? But we did the national anthem, and my now 14-year-old daughter at the time was, Kit was 6. Jeez. was sitting there in a little dress, belting out the national anthem, as were our three boys and my wife. And so catching her doing that was one of those moments that was just sort of amazing, right? And then on a more somewhat serious note, I mean, I think folks are aware I lost my mother quite unexpectedly over Labor Day. And a group of folks at the university sort of surprised me, and Vice President Donahue was instrumental in this because I was having a morning meeting with her on a Friday, and she's like, "Oh, let's go walk down." And I know you were supposed to see Avery Dulles Hall, but you couldn't see it. So let's go check it out. And I was like, "Oh, let's drive down there." She's like, "No, let's walk down." And what it turned out was there's now a bench right next to the pond, Bellarmine Pond, just across from where the Barnyard townhouses are. And the team had actually dedicated a bench in honor of my mother there. So I'm going to get weepy. And to be working in a place where people do that, it's really remarkable, right? My mom had been a big fan of the Quick Center. It literally was on the path that she would occasionally walk with my daughter to go from the house to the Quick. So in some ways, I mean, it's not a moment of celebration because it's a memorial, but if there's a moment, in the last, few months that embodies what this community is about, it's something like that, right? And I think it's also important because it's, one of the things you realize as university president, given the complexity of the organization, given the breadth of what one has to do, right? Everything from celebrating commencement to comforting grieving parents who lost a son is, this is about the duality of life, right? And I think if there's anything that our faith and our tradition here is asked us to reinforce, and it sounds like a bit of a leap, but it's not. It's what makes athletics so special too, is that those dualities in athletics happen so intensely and so frequently. For every winner, there's a loser, right? And it's about managing those moments. And I've been reflecting a lot on this, in part because it's been 6 months, and so they say with grief. And also, my mother and my father actually came out at my invitation, but at my mother's insistence, to the Indiana games we had a year ago, right? So I've been thinking a lot about her since she wasn't able to see this season. Is just that notion of how important community is, right? And so, for me, and that's why, again, I say, people call me President Nemec, Dr. Nemec. It's polite, but, I'm just one of many individuals who are sort of part of this community. Thousands of individuals are part of this community. I'm the one who has the blessing of sort of stewardship. And I have to say, as a team, we're blessed to be doing really well in that stewardship. But it's that, notion of what in the small way are those moments that are most sort of reflective of an institution at its best, right? And so, I would say that's sort of, for me personally, sounds like an odd thing to say, a memorial dedication is a favorite moment, but it's a moment that's sort of probably representative of who we are and what we are in so many ways.
I'm not sure if this is, I know it's one of your favorite moments. I'm not sure where this one ranks amongst them. The student versus faculty basketball game last year.
Oh, yeah, that was fun. Well,
this is my question.
Okay.
What was the mindset heading into that game, and how do you rate your performance? That's my last one.
Oh, that's a good transition. Well, my mindset was I wanted to play well, and I didn't. My other mindset was I literally had not actually, because we have a basket outside in our driveway, and I occasionally go out there and shoot.
Sure.
But I hadn't actually run up and down a court. And it wasn't that I was tired, but I was definitely slightly, you forget how important it is to sort of be oriented to, it was disorienting is the only word I would use, right? Yeah. So I'm blessed. I still stay, relatively active. Up in July, I was playing in a rugby tournament and played 3 80-minute games in 3 days. Wow. So I don't mind that, but what I did find on the court was I was never tired, but just knowing where to go and how to go, and also you realize you can't jump anymore. So I think that was the other thing. There was more than one time where I went up thinking I would be able to grab the ball, and somebody just jumped over me and got it. So I would rate my performances. I don't know. Let's see. In the old rugby, they tend to rate on a 1 to 10 scale.
Sure.
I'd give myself maybe a 4.
Hey, but per Coach Carly and Coach Erica Brown, who we've talked to this semester, you were diving for
Yeah, but that
basketballs,
doesn't.
but
Effort doesn't make up for lack of effectiveness.
Being
but
a tangible
effort is
asset.
sometimes the most important part.
It does. I did grab one offensive rebound, but then immediately
go.
turned the ball over and
It's
then
all right.
missed my free throws and missed the 3. So that was not that I keep track of this. And more importantly, we lost. And the reason we lost, to be candid, is we won everything. Well, it was an interesting indication. We basically weren't awake to start, didn't realize, see, this is also an old timer. I was defending old school basketball, so we were trying to protect the paint. When you're up against these young people, don't even know what the paint is, so all they're going to do is jack threes.
That's it.
And we ended up like falling behind because I think the student team was like 70% from 3-point range to start the game. Wow. And so we dug ourselves too much of a hole. And I think it was 16-4 at the end of the first quarter. Who's counting? So we'll get him this year.
Are we doing it again this year?
I think supposedly, but I haven't seen the announcement. Allegedly, it's April 16th, but I haven't seen anything.
We'll get in
announced.
on that if we can.
We'll
All
take from our staff. We'll maybe take a couple people to kind of wrap up here. In this last 45 minutes, when you leave Fairfield, when it's all said and done,
Yeah.
what do you want your overall impact to be?
Oh, wow. That's a. Well, it gets back to that question I answered earlier, right?
Mhm.
Which is, I think I want folks to. Well, I want to have a sense that Fairfield is a much stronger, sort of far-reaching, and both far and deeper impacting institution than it was when I arrived. And I think we're making strides in that regard. And so what does that mean? It means, we have continued to achieve in regards to academic excellence, right? It means that we continue to celebrate human flourishing and achievement in athletics and culture and the arts. And it continues to mean that we're broadening access to reach ever broader audiences in ever more innovative ways, right? That's why you do something like Austin, Texas. And so what I would say, though, is that that's just the beginning, right? I mean, I think the other thing for me is this is really a momentous year. It's obviously personally, as I just spent too much time talking about with losing my mother, but I think it's also a year that I came to Fairfield with sort of a 14-year vision in mind based on 2 7-year strategic arcs. And that's something I borrowed from Bob Zimmer, who was the president of U Chicago, who used to talk about people tend to take either too briefly or too long in terms of strategy. And actually, 7 years is sort of the perfect model for us because as a student-centric institution, when you really think about it, when you arrive as a first year, you really look up to the seniors. And when you're a senior, you look back to the first years. So it means sort of the shadow of any one student who's with us for 4 years as undergrad is 7 years, right? So we're now in the next 7-year arc, and having had conversations with the trustees and others, I'm already envisioning, okay, I came in with sort of a 14-year plan, but I think it's certainly perfectly appropriate, given all the gains we've made, to ask, okay, what does the next 14 years look like, right? And then you get to that point, and I've actually continued to think, okay, what does Fairfield look like? It seems like a long way off, but, I get a lot of energy from this. What are we going to look like on our 100th anniversary, right? So I always tend to work back from there.
Okay.
And one of the keys is we never want to lose what's always made Fairfield Fairfield. And I think one of the things that was funny, I was just talking to someone else about this, that's unique about Fairfield is the extent to, and this is one of the things that attracted me to the role, was I was going through the LinkedIn profiles of the folks that I had worked with, and you sort by alma mater, and I was sort of struck by how many people I'd worked with who had gone to Fairfield, who I didn't know had gone to Fairfield, but how much they were all people I enjoyed working with.
Right.
They were people I could trust, and they were people who really worked hard, embraced being part of a team. And I couldn't even say that about people from my own alma mater. So, so this notion that we don't lose sight of that while then also doing that at a broader scale, at ever higher quality, I think is really what I see. And then folks saying, wow, Fairfield truly is a model for what a great mid-sized university can be in all aspects. I think, if you wanted to sort of put it simply, it gets back to being a model of modern excellence, a model of the modern Jesuit Catholic University that isn't just a model for Jesuit Catholic institutions, but is a model for all of American higher education across the board.
Well said.
President Nemec, thank you so much for being here. It was an absolute treat to have you in the studio today. From Logan Rundy, your assistant sports director here at WVOF, Andrew Jamison, our sports director across the table. President Nemec, we wish you the best of luck with the final, 6-7 weeks of the academic calendar year.
You too.
And we're excited to see where this university goes in the future years.
Thanks.